Picture a 9-year-old boy standing on the Mongolian steppe, watching his entire world walk away from him. His father is dead, poisoned days earlier by enemies who recognized him at the wrong campfire. And now, with no protector left, the tribe that once followed his family simply leaves. No violence, no confrontation. They just pack up their tents and ride off, abandoning a widow and her 5 children to survive alone on one of the harshest landscapes on earth. That boy's name was Temujin. He had no army, no title, no food. Most days, his family survived on roots, wild onions, and whatever fish they could pull from a river. Within a few years, this same boy would kill his own half-brother in a dispute over a stolen bird and a fish. And yet, this starving, abandoned child would grow up to build the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, bigger than Rome at its height, bigger than the empire of Alexander the Great, a domain so vast that a message could travel from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Europe, entirely on roads he controlled. He would take a new name, one that would come to mean terror in a dozen languages, and a founding father in his own homeland, Genghis Khan. This is the story of how he got there, and why, 800 years later, people still can't agree on whether he was history's greatest conqueror or one of its worst monsters. Let's go back to the beginning. Sometime around 1162, historians actually argue between 1155, 1162, and 1167, because the sources contradict each other. According to one contemporary historian, Temujin himself may not have even known his own birth year. A boy was born to a minor Mongol chieftain named Yesugei and his wife, Hoelun. And Hoelun's own story is already brutal. Yesugei didn't court her. He abducted her, pulled her away from her actual husband-to-be while she was traveling to her own wedding. That was, unfortunately, just how alliances and marriages sometimes worked on the steppe. Legend says the baby was born clutching a blood clot in his fist. In the folklore of the time, a sign that the child was destined to be a warrior. Whether or not that's true, what's certain is that his father named him Temujin, likely after a rival chieftain he'd just defeated in battle. Right from birth, this kid's name was basically a war trophy. Temujin's childhood looked completely normal for a steppe aristocrat's son, right up until it wasn't. At 8 years old, his father took him to a neighboring tribe to arrange his marriage to a girl named Borte, the daughter of a chieftain. That was standard practice. What happened next wasn't. On the ride home, alone, Yesugei stopped at a Tatar camp and asked for food. Steppe tradition demanded hospitality to travelers, even strangers, but these particular Tatars recognized him as an old enemy. They poisoned his meal. Yesugei made it home before he died, just long enough to send for his son. And then everything Temujin's family had built collapsed overnight. Because here's the brutal truth about steppe politics. Loyalty followed strength, not bloodlines. With Yesugei dead, and his heir just a child, the tribe simply abandoned Hoelun's family. They weren't even invited to the ancestor worship ceremonies that followed a leader's death. The ultimate signal that they no longer mattered. Hoelun, in one of the more remarkable moments preserved in Mongol oral history, rode after the departing tribe, holding her husband's banner, trying to publicly shame them into staying. It didn't work. Her family was left to fend for itself, reduced to a hunter-gatherer existence, digging for roots, catching marmots, fishing. A massive fall in status for a chieftain's widow. And it's in this desperate poverty that the darkest part of Temujin's childhood happens. He had an older half-brother named Beta from his father's second wife, and tension between them had been building for years. Arguments over hunting spoils, over who would eventually lead the family, even the uncomfortable possibility that Beta, as the elder son, could eventually marry Temujin's own mother, under steppe inheritance customs. The breaking point, according to the most detailed surviving source, was almost absurdly petty, a fight over a fish and a bird that Beta had taken from the younger boys. Temujin and his full brother Kasar ambushed Beta and killed him. This is one of those details historians take seriously, specifically because it's so unflattering. It only survives in one source, the secret history of the Mongols, because the official sanitized chronicles written under his descendants conveniently left it out. But the secret history doesn't flinch. It records Holan furiously condemning her sons for what they'd done. A starving, abandoned 9-year-old had just killed a member of his own family to secure his place as head of the household. This was the world that shaped Genghis Khan. One where survival meant ruthlessness and softness got you left behind on the steppe to die. Being fatherless and tribeless made Temujin a target. He was captured multiple times by a rival clan called the Taichiyud. In one escape, as the story goes, he slipped away during a festival, hid first in a river, and was found by a man named Sorkan Shira, who had spotted him, but chose not to raise the alarm. Sorkan Shira then hid Temujin in his own tent for 3 days at massive personal risk before helping him get away entirely. That single act of mercy from a stranger would matter enormously later. Loyalty, kindness, and betrayal on the steppe were currencies Temujin tracked obsessively for the rest of his life. And he never forgot a debt, in either direction. Around this same period, a teenager named Borchu helped Temujin track down a band of horse thieves who'd stolen his family's animals the family desperately needed to survive. Borchu asked for nothing in return and simply joined Temujin's camp afterward. He would go on to become one of Genghis Khan's most trusted military commanders. This is the first hint of the pattern that would define his entire rise. Temujin didn't attract followers through inherited status. He attracted them through personal loyalty, earned one relationship at a time. At 15, Temujin finally returned to claim his bride, Portray, and her father, who'd assumed his prospective son-in-law was probably dead, was thrilled to see him alive. Portray's mother gave Holan a gift, an extremely expensive sable cloak. And here's where you see Temujin's political instincts emerging early. Instead of keeping that valuable cloak, he re-gifted it to a powerful steppe ruler named Togrul, Khan of the Kharite tribe, a man who had once sworn a blood brotherhood oath with Temujin's late father. It was a calculated move. Buy protection from a major power broker with a gift he didn't even have to pay for himself. Togrul, delighted, took Temujin under his wing. But peace didn't last. Around 300 Merkit raiders, descendants of the man Temujin's father had once stolen Holan from, attacked the camp, seeking generational revenge. Temujin and his brothers escaped up a sacred mountain, but Portray was captured and, following steppe custom, given in marriage to another man. Temujin called in every favor he had. Togrul agreed to send troops. So did his childhood blood brother, a rising steppe leader named Jamuka. Together, they crushed the Merkits and recovered Portray, who was already pregnant. She soon gave birth to a son named Joki. And this is where one of the most quietly devastating details of Genghis Khan's entire life shows up. Because of the timing of the pregnancy, nobody, not even Temujin himself, as far as we know, could be entirely certain whether Joki was his biological son. Temujin raised him as his own, without hesitation. But the question of Jochi's parentage followed him for his entire life, and it would eventually help determine the fate of an empire. For about 1.5 years, Temujin and Jamuka's followers camped together. The secret history describes the two of them renewing their childhood blood oath, and even sleeping side by side under one blanket. The account frames it as deep, genuine brotherhood. Some modern historians suspect the reality was more transactional, that Temujin was essentially serving under Jamuka in exchange for his help with the Merkits. Whatever the truth, the friendship didn't survive contact with ambition. The two men split. The surviving account claims it was over a cryptic remark Jamuka made about where to make camp, though it's likely code for a much deeper power struggle. Most of the established tribal aristocracy stayed loyal to Jamuka, but 41 lesser leaders, along with a wave of ordinary commoners, chose to follow Temujin instead. That's the moment the two blood brothers became rivals. Temujin's followers soon acclaimed him Khan of the Mongols in his own right, a direct challenge to the established order. Togrul was pleased at his rising protégé's promotion. Jamukar was furious. The rivalry exploded into open war around 1187 at the Battle of Dalan Baljud. The two forces were evenly matched, and Temujin lost, badly. Some later chronicles, written generations afterward under his own dynasty, tried to quietly rewrite this into a victory, but the earlier, more reliable evidence is blunt. This was a real defeat. One significant enough that Temujin essentially vanishes from the historical record for close to a decade afterward. Where did he go? Modern historians now believe the most likely answer is one that would have been deeply embarrassing to admit at the time. Temujin probably spent years as a subject, quite possibly a servant, of the Jurchen Jin dynasty in northern China, the great imperial power on the Mongols' southern border. A Chinese diplomat who visited the Mongols decades later recorded, matter-of-factly, that the future conqueror of half the known world had once been effectively enslaved by the very empire he would eventually help bring to its knees. That detail never appears in Mongol chronicles. It only survives because a foreign diplomat who owed the Mongol court no flattery wrote it down. Meanwhile, Jamukar, having won at Dalan Baljut, revealed a genuinely brutal streak, reportedly boiling 70 captured enemies alive and desecrating the bodies of rival leaders. It backfired. Disgusted and frightened followers began quietly defecting to Temujin instead, drawn as much by his growing reputation for fairness as by his wealth. By 1196, Temujin re-emerges into the historical record with startling speed. He joined the Jin in a campaign against the Tatars, the very tribe that had poisoned his father, and was rewarded by the Jin with an honorary military title. He also helped Togrul reclaim leadership of the Kharite after it had been usurped. Officially, Temujin was still Togrul's subordinate. In practice, he was becoming his equal. For the next several years, Temujin and Togrul campaigned together against the Merkits, the Naimans, and the Tatars. In 1201, a coalition of dissatisfied tribes tried to break the growing dominance of the Mongol-Kharite alliance, electing Jamukar as their supreme leader. Temujin and Togrul crushed them, and Jamukar was forced to beg his former ally Togrul for mercy. But success was making Temujin dangerous, to everyone, including his patron. He proposed a marriage alliance between his son Joki and one of Togrul's daughters. Togrul's own son, a man named Sengum, saw right through it. This wasn't a marriage proposal. It was an attempt to absorb the Kharite tribe entirely. And the lingering rumors about Jochi's true parentage only made the insult worse. Jamukar, sensing an opportunity for revenge, whispered warnings into Togrul's ear about how Temujin kept promoting low-born commoners into positions of real power, a direct threat to the entire aristocratic order of the steppe. Togrul took the bait. He set an ambush. Two herdsmen overheard the plan and warned Temujin just in time. He scraped together what forces he could and met Togrul's army at a place called the Kalakaljid Sands. He lost, decisively. This was, by any measure, the lowest point of Temujin's adult life. Retreating to a muddy lake or river called Baljuna, with a shattered, exhausted band of followers, he had almost nothing left. One of his most loyal companions had lost his horse and had to flee on foot. His own son, Ogedei, had been badly wounded and had to be carried out on someone else's back. And it's here, surrounded by the last handful of people still willing to follow him, that Temujin did something that would define the rest of his life. He raised his hands to the sky and swore an oath, recorded centuries later in the history of Yuan, promising that if he ever achieved his ambitions, he would share everything, the sweet and the bitter alike, with every person standing there with him. If he broke that promise, he said, let him be like water, drunk up and gone. According to the account, there wasn't a dry eye among his officers. This moment, later called the Baljuna Covenant, became almost sacred to the men who lived through it. And it's worth noting who exactly took that oath. This wasn't a group of loyal Mongols. It was a mixed band from 9 different tribes, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists among them, bound to each other by nothing except loyalty to this one man, and to one another. Historians have since described it as a kind of proto-government for an empire that didn't exist yet. Temujin regrouped. Using a clever ambush, his forces caught the Kharite completely off guard at the Jeje Heights. After 3 brutal days of fighting, he won decisively. Sengum fled all the way to Tibet. Togrul himself, fleeing alone, ran into a Naiman patrol who didn't recognize the great Khan they were killing and executed him as an anonymous fugitive. The man who had once been Temujin's protector and adopted father figure died anonymously at the hands of strangers because nobody bothered to check who he was. Temujin absorbed the entire Kharite elite into his own following. Only one major power remained standing between him and total control of the steppe, the Naiman tribe in the west, where Jamuka had fled after his own defeats, now serving under yet another master. In 1204, at the Battle of Chakarmaut in the Altai Mountains, Temujin crushed the Naiman as well. Their leader was killed. Jamuka, who had abandoned the Naiman before the battle even ended, was eventually betrayed to Temujin by his own remaining companions. Companions Temujin then had executed anyway, for the crime of disloyalty to their previous leader, even though that disloyalty was what handed Temujin his final rival. And what happened between the 2 former blood brothers at the very end is genuinely haunting. According to the secret history, Jamuka, rather than face public execution, asked his childhood Anda to grant him an honorable death instead. Other, harsher accounts claim he was simply torn apart. Either way, the man who had once shared a blanket with Temujin as a boy was dead, and Temujin stood alone as the single most powerful figure on the entire Mongolian steppe. In 1206, Temujin summoned every remaining tribal leader to a great assembly called a Kurultai at the source of the Onon River. There, the abandoned boy who once ate roots to survive formally took a new title, Genghis Khan. Historians still argue over what the name actually meant. Some believe it signified strength or hardness. Others connect it to an old word for ocean, implying universal ruler. Whatever the precise meaning, everyone understood the message. There was now exactly one power on the steppe, and it wasn't going to be divided by tribe ever again. And this is where Genghis Khan does something that separates him from every steppe conqueror who came before him. Nomadic empires had risen and collapsed for centuries, always falling apart the same way, because their armies were built on tribal loyalty, and tribes eventually turned on each other. Genghis Khan set out to permanently break that pattern. He reorganized the entire Mongol nation into a military decimal system, units of 10, 100, and 1,000, and deliberately scattered defeated tribes across different units so old identities couldn't reform into rebellion. Every single man between 15 and 70 was folded into this new structure. Old tribal names essentially ceased to matter. What mattered now was loyalty to the great Mongol state, and to commanders promoted purely on merit and loyalty to Genghis personally. And he meant that meritocracy, literally. His 2 most senior military commanders, Burchu and Mukhali, were each given command of 10,000 men, despite neither one coming from an aristocratic background. Historians have pointed out that many of his highest-ranking generals started life as the sons of blacksmiths, shepherds, and carpenters. Even 2 ordinary herdsmen who had once warned him about an ambush were rewarded with positions of real authority. On the steppe, where bloodline had always determined status, this was close to revolutionary. He also expanded his personal bodyguard, the Keshig, from just over 1,000 men to 10,000. Technically hostages, drawn from the sons and brothers of his commanders, but in practice functioning as an elite military academy and the administrative core of his entire government. Several of his greatest future generals started their careers right there, inside the Keshig, before earning independent commands. Not everyone accepted this new order quietly. A powerful shaman named Kokechu, the very man who had first proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, began using his religious authority to try to divide the ruling family, humiliating and threatening Genghis's own brothers. For a while, Genghis, who genuinely believed in the shaman's spiritual power, tolerated it. But when his wife Portray warned him that Kokechu had become a direct political threat, Genghis had him quietly eliminated and then absorbed the dead shaman's religious authority for himself. The message was unmistakable. No one, no matter how sacred, stood above the state Genghis Khan was building. With the steppe unified, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the great civilizations on his borders. And the first target was the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia, a wealthy, walled, agricultural state to the south. After a series of raids, Genghis personally led a full invasion in 1209. It didn't go smoothly. The Mongols lacked real siege equipment, reduced at first to little more than crude battering rams against Western Xia's fortified capital. Genghis even attempted to flood the city by diverting the Yellow River, a plan that actually worked at first, until the poorly built Mongol earthworks broke and flooded his own camp instead, forcing a retreat. Still, the Xia emperor, sufficiently rattled, agreed to submit and pay tribute, including handing over his own daughter in marriage. Next came the real target, the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, the same empire that may have once held Genghis as a subject or servant. When the Jin demanded their usual tribute in 1210, Genghis's response was to spit on the ground in front of their envoy and ride away. That was, unmistakably, a declaration of war against an empire that could field an army possibly 8 times the size of his own. The campaign that followed lasted years and swung wildly back and forth. Mongol forces smashed through China's northern defenses with help from defectors, scored major victories, and then stalled for years outside the walls of the Jin capital, Zhongdu, while Genghis's own army was ravaged by epidemic and, according to one European friar's account, possibly exaggerated, forced into cannibalism from starvation. Genghis finally negotiated a truce, walking away with a staggering ransom. Thousands of horses, hundreds of slaves, a Jin princess, and enormous quantities of gold and silk. But when the Jin emperor then relocated his own capital hundreds of kilometers south, a move Genghis interpreted, probably correctly, as preparation to regroup and restart the war, Genghis considered the treaty broken. He returned, and this time Zhongdu fell for good in 1215, sacked in a brutal capture that the historical record does not sugarcoat. Genghis then handed the ongoing China campaign to one of his most trusted generals, Mukhali, and turned his attention west, toward a threat and an opportunity that would define the darkest and most infamous chapter of his entire life. By this point, Genghis Khan controlled the eastern half of the Silk Road. To his west lay the enormous Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across Central Asia, Persia, and Afghanistan. Genghis, apparently uninterested in conquest here at first, wanted trade. He sent a massive merchant caravan, 450 traders, backed by members of his own extended family, toward Khwarezmian territory. The governor of the border town of Otrar had the entire caravan massacred, seizing their goods on flimsy accusations of espionage. Whether the Khwarezmian ruler, Muhammad II, personally approved this or simply looked the other way, historians still debate. But what happened next made it irrelevant. Genghis sent ambassadors to demand justice. Muhammad had the lead ambassador executed and mutilated his companions before sending them back. This was, by the code of the steppe, close to the single worst offense imaginable. The ancient principle of achi kariulk, good for good, evil for evil, demanded a response, and killing an envoy overrode every other consideration. Genghis Khan left a modest force to continue the war in China and turned the full weight of his empire westward. What followed was one of the most devastatingly efficient military campaigns in recorded history, and also one of its bloodiest. Muhammad, whose empire was larger than Genghis's but fractured by internal rivalries, made the fatal decision to hide his troops behind city walls rather than meet the Mongols in open battle. That decision handed total freedom of movement to the fastest, most disciplined cavalry force on the planet. City after city fell in rapid succession: Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, while Muhammad fled westward, pursued relentlessly by 2 of Genghis's finest generals, Jebbe and Subutai, until he died alone of dysentery on a remote island in the Caspian Sea, having lost an empire in less than 2 years. But it's the campaign led by Genghis's youngest son, Tolui, through the region of Khorasan that cemented Genghis Khan's reputation as one of history's most feared names. City after city that resisted, Nishapur, Merv, Herat, among the largest and wealthiest cities on earth at the time, was utterly destroyed. Contemporary Persian chroniclers, writing in the immediate aftermath, claim the death toll from those 3 cities alone exceeded 5.5 million people, a figure modern historians consider a wild exaggeration, likely inflated for dramatic or religious effect. But even the more conservative modern estimate, around 1.25 million dead across the entire campaign, describes a demographic catastrophe on a scale the region had never experienced before and, in some areas, arguably never fully recovered from. This is the chapter of Genghis Khan's life responsible for his enduring image, in much of the world, as a synonym for annihilation itself. And yet, even amid the devastation, Genghis Khan's curiosity never stopped. During his long return journey, he summoned a Taoist monk named Chang Chun, all the way from China, to meet him in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. Listening attentively to his religious teachings, and granting Taoist monks sweeping tax exemptions across his empire. A strange, almost contradictory glimpse of the same man capable of both wholesale slaughter and genuine intellectual openness. Genghis returned toward Mongolia, but one final piece of unfinished business remained: the kingdom of Western Xia, which had refused to send troops for the Khwarezmian campaign and, sensing an opportunity while Genghis was away, had stopped cooperating with his forces in China altogether. In 1226, in his mid-60s, Genghis Khan personally led one final invasion into Western Xia, a brutal campaign that cracked through the region's cities one after another with little mercy shown. And then, during the winter, disaster struck in the most mundane way imaginable for a man who had survived decades of warfare. While out hunting, Genghis Khan fell from his horse. He never fully recovered. His health declined steadily over the following months. His own sons and generals begged him to break off the siege of the Shia capital and return home to recover, arguing the campaign could simply resume the following year. He refused, reportedly enraged by a fresh insult hurled at him by a Shah commander, and insisted the siege continue. Genghis Khan died on either the 18th or the 25th of August, 1227. His death was kept a closely guarded secret from the enemy, so the siege wouldn't lose momentum. The Shia capital fell the following month, still unaware its besieger was already dead, and its population was subjected to catastrophic, near-total destruction. One historian has bluntly called it a very successful ethnocide. The exact cause of Genghis Khan's death remains genuinely uncertain. Some sources point to an illness, possibly malaria, typhus, or even plague. Marco Polo, writing decades later, claimed he died from an arrow wound. A European friar reported he was struck by lightning. And one much more colourful legend, almost certainly invented long after the fact, claims a captured Shia princess assassinated him during a private moment together. Historians treat that last story with heavy skepticism, but it says something about the Shia mythology that had already grown up around this man in his own lifetime. His body was carried back to Mongolia and buried, according to tradition, somewhere near a sacred mountain he had personally chosen years earlier. The exact location was deliberately kept secret. And to this day, despite extensive searching, Genghis Khan's tomb has never been found. Genghis Khan began his life with absolutely nothing. No father, no tribe, no protection. Nothing but a mother's determination and a handful of loyal companions willing to follow a penniless boy across a frozen, unforgiving steppe. He built, from that nothing, an empire that reshaped the entire world. And he did it through a combination of total loyalty to his own people and total ruthlessness toward anyone who stood in his way. The same qualities that let a 9-year-old survive being abandoned by his tribe would, decades later, let a grown man level some of the greatest cities on earth without hesitation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise of one of history's most consequential and controversial figures, let me know in the comments which part of his story surprised you the most. And subscribe for more stories where ambition, survival, and empire collide.